So as part of our 6-week course, I want to produce something like a little guiding video for each week. And this is week 1. Now, there are a number of things, usually 2 or 3 things that we cover each week. And I would consider them to be things or hurdles you need to get over in order to use this method properly. In order to use it effectively, I would say that these are the things you need to have discussed with yourself, to become convinced of, to have studied them and to understand them. And in this week 1, I'm going to talk about, first of all, the medical model versus the biblical model, which is a huge factor. And the idea of who we are, how we are constructed in the biblical model as opposed to the medical ideas. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the brain and the mind and the relationship between them. So that would be week 1. So let's make a start. I'm going to start today by reading from the book. At the moment, it's page 15, and it just says, what is the medical model? So I'm going to read through this and then I'm going to discuss it for a few minutes. So I do, first of all, give a quote here by Immanuel Kant. He's a very famous, well-known philosopher. And he was talking about what he wanted. And he said that all the insane be turned over to the philosophers and that the medical men stop mixing into the business of the human mind. And of course, you know, that's exactly what's happened, is that the medical model has now gone into psychology and psychiatry and stopped just looking at things under a microscope, but actually got involved in the human condition. So let me read from the book. Having given you a biblical view into the human condition and the issues we face, I now want to remind you just how much the medical model differs from the biblical view. How influential this idea, this medical model might have been in your life, especially in the way you might have approached your personal development and growth. In other words, the way you think about yourself. For at least the last 150 years, our Western culture has been soaked, you could say saturated, in what I will call the medical model. This very powerful way of looking at things arose from the scientific approach. It affects everything we do, especially the way we think about ourselves. This is because this way of thinking has been largely accepted as the way to think about ourselves. Now, you may be shocked to find how much this view has influenced the way you've not only think about yourself, but the way you manage yourself, not to mention the way it might have even influenced the church that you have attended. It is in fact incredibly influential, especially around our mental and emotional well-being. Thousands of books offer tempting straplines about how you can be a better you, stop being a failure, say goodbye to depression, etc., etc. Now, what do most of these books have in common? They're mostly based on the medical model. Most problematic about this is that, like some other worldly things, it has got into the church. Now, as a result, it's become in some ways mixed in with God's teaching and has produced as much confusion among the suffering saved as it has the unsaved. The medical model benefits and limitations. Now, at the time of writing, the world is dealing with a global pandemic around the coronavirus. We see photos of this virus on news feeds every day, and it's a perfect example of how useful the medical model can be. As a pathologizing model, it always starts with the same question: what's wrong with you? It helps us find cures and vaccines for things like the coronavirus. Now, this view makes sense because a virus can be seen under a microscope. But let me ask you, can you see an attitude, a belief, or even a feeling under a microscope? Of course not. So at that point, we can start to see some limits to the medical model. The problem is that our society has become so saturated with this type of thinking that we're now literally applying it to everything. How many times do you hear yourself and others say, "What's wrong with me?" There's something wrong with you. Psychology, based on the medical model, attempts to discover the problem, then to quantify, describe, name, diagnose, and cure it. The act of looking for and differentiating between patients' issues leads to an ever-growing number of conditions. The DSM-5 now includes enough diagnosable and nameable conditions that in 2014, more than 50% of Americans were included as suffering from one or another of the growing list of conditions. Now, just let me pause there for a second. Imagine how much that's changed in the last 8 years. I wonder what percentage of Americans are now said to be suffering from one of these conditions. Most people would agree that the two main institutions in modern society have been the church and science. When we think about what they've said about the parts of our personality, as we're going to talk about, what have they said about it? Well, basically they both end up in the same place, generally. One demonizes them and the other pathologizes them. Either way, the two most influential bodies in our world have suggested that these parts need to be fought with and got rid of, either because they're evil spirits or mental conditions. Neuroscience has blown these ideas out of the water as modern digital research literally catches up with the Bible. In Luke 8 verse 43, we read about a woman who was suffering with a bleeding issue that had been untreatable for 12 years. Of course, this was not a prodigal son type of rock bottom as such, but let me ask you this. Would she have produced the faith that healed her if she had not suffered for all that time? Faith that drew power from the Lord so much that he asked, "Who touched me?" Faith that produced an effect that happened to no one else on that day, even though many people touched him. Suffering brings moments that cannot be recreated. So that's a little excerpt there from the book, and it really is asking us to consider the power of the medical model, how much it influences and affects the way we think about ourselves, the way we talk about ourselves, and particularly the way we manage ourselves. What do we do about things? What do we say to ourselves about ourselves? Now, Proverbs 3, and I think it's verse 5 and 6, says, "Do not lean on your own understanding." And elsewhere in Romans, Paul talks about man's wisdom being nothing but manure, to God. The medical model ultimately is man's wisdom. And as I said in the book, it's very useful when we're dealing with what we might call biological issues, things that can be seen under a microscope. Extremely useful and really valuable. Some brilliant people working in it. But when it starts to shift into things that are intangible, things that we can barely see, certainly not put under a microscope, it starts to, what has it done effectively? It's tried to make these issues into biological issues, when in fact, I would say they're more social and spiritual issues. So the idea that this thing has really influenced the way you see yourself, this is the thing I want you to come to terms with. I want you to consider it in the way that you think about yourself. If we don't do this, then we don't understand the difference between the medical model and the biblical model. See, the Bible, Ephesians 2:10, for instance, says that you are God's masterpiece, The Bible says that you're fearfully and wonderfully made. That's not starting from the point of what's wrong with you. It's starting from the point of what's right with you. And it's saying that you are God's masterpiece. You are his workmanship. And to me, we need to get back to that idea of what God says about us, how we have been made, right? So as we go on with this course, you're going to see how when we start from that point and we say, well, what if what was going on in your life was because things are working well? What if it's because you're designed well? What if it's because things are working well? Well, we get to a very different place. And of course, we're going to cover this as part of the course. I'm not going to go into it all now. But I want you to get, first of all, into the contrast between the way the Bible talks about you and the way that medical science talks about you. So I'm going to read a little bit more from the book now. How does the medical model work? And this is from page 17. By starting with the idea of what's wrong with you, the model essentially says you need to change. Or in other words, you need to be less like you. And this is an important point. When we're talking about mental or emotional issues, I think this is a bit like telling a cheetah that it should have stripes rather than spots, you know? It often places us as a patient in an impossible position because of the way it creates inner conflict or self-loathing. It often leaves people with a sense that they have to change, whilst at the same time defining a self-image that feels inadequate to the task. The biblical approach says just the opposite of the medical model. This is the idea I want you to get familiar with. I'm going to show you that becoming more like you, not less like you, is a much more effective approach when attempting to outgrow your addiction or dependence, or to grow as a person. You'll also learn how Jesus has modeled this for us and offers us a God-given method. Of course, the reason a medical model has been so successful in defining the way we think about ourselves is that it often matches the way we feel. You know how you do things wrong and you fail at things and you have problems? The medical model echoes your experience by saying, well, that's because there's something wrong with you, and offers you then a way to fix yourself, often with a pill or a medicine. This model and the approach it takes has produced a self-help industry that is set to be annually turning over $13.2 billion in 2022. Not to mention a medicinal pill industry, which is set to be turning over $1,033 billion annually in 2022. But ask yourself, if these approaches were effective, wouldn't they be leveling out or shrinking by now? Again, I don't want to get too political in the same way I don't want to get too theological in this course. But I do want to make this point that this whole industry and the way it's got us thinking about ourselves, if it was working, if it was effective, it would be shrinking or leveling out. But it's not. It's growing massively every year. And if I could say it this way, and this is about as political as I'll get, it's one of the few businesses in the world that only succeeds if it fails. Just think about that. Most businesses need to succeed to succeed. This one doesn't. It needs to fail. I could say a lot more, but I don't want to get into the political side of it. I want you to understand this idea that the medical approach is saying be less like you. You have to change. And I promise you will very rarely hear me use the word change on this course or when I work with you. It's not one of my favorite words. The biblical approach, and I'm going to show you how this comes about. It says, I want you to be more like you. You see, if you're fearfully and wonderfully made, if you are God's masterpiece, then we want to see more of it. We don't want to see less of it. You know, Jesus says, you know, don't hide it under your lamp under a bushel. You know, basically a city on a hill, you know, it needs to be seen. And so the way that God has made you, that's the thing we want to see. Obviously, it gets covered up with our sinful nature. It gets covered up with the way the world is, and it gets covered up by the way the world has treated us and trained us to be, and so on. But what is ultimately and uniquely you that God has made, that we want to see. And that I'm calling being more like you. Okay, so we're also going to talk a little bit now about the relationship between the brain and the mind, and particularly how I want you to think about it with regards to this course. Again, it's one of those things that we need to address in order for you to use the course and the methods in it most effectively. So I'm going to read from the book again. This is page 34, and this is a section called The Flesh and the Spirit. To help you make sense of this approach and to use it to grow and to make progress, I now want to explain the way to think about your inner workings, how you feel, how you think. There are many ways to understand this: your brain, your mind, your unconscious, not to mention the spirit, the flesh. People talk about the soul and all kinds of things that can actually confuse us more than anything. For this approach, we will be simplifying things down so that we can do two things. Firstly, to help us focus on what we are wanting to use. And secondly, to help us understand the way that psychological world and medical terms actually match up with the more biblical and spiritual terms we will be using. So there's a graphic here which I will explain. I may even put it on the recording so you can see what it means. It helps you to translate the terms with the opposing ideas laid out and how to translate them, finally drilling down to the brain and the mind. So this graphic is to help you understand how to think of yourself and how science is actually catching up with the Bible. So we start out with the big divide, and that is the world and the kingdom of God. In John 18 verse 36, Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place." So we can interpret this as being the difference between the flesh and the spirit. In other words, the world and the kingdom of God actually is also the flesh and the spirit. We can then go further and we can see the disciples as the flesh and Jesus as the spirit. Finally, we can understand this divide and use it as the brain and the mind. So as we approach the practice of this book, I want you to think of your mind as your spirit and your brain as the flesh. This helps us to understand why you're so often in conflict with yourself. So understanding the brain and mind relationship, we read first from 1 Corinthians 2:16. "For who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ." Never before have we understood so well the way the brain works, and particularly the relationship between the brain and the mind. Think of your mind as a small part of your brain that is conscious and as a moral centre. It's the frontal lobes, the filter through which everything must pass. The way you make meaning and decide things, even now as you're reading this. The brain, on the other hand, is best thought of as your engine room, behind the scenes. Your brain is running and monitoring many systems, regulating pressures and flow, temperature and efficiency in ways I'm not anywhere near qualified to describe. I know that it does this 24/7 without ever sleeping and without you knowing about it. So your brain doesn't really care about most of the decisions that you're making during the day. Decisions like what jumper should I wear today, what sandwich should I choose for lunch. But there are some things that alert your brain to get involved. Think of the relationship between your brain and your mind like that of licensing. Your life is being run by your mind on license from your brain. In other words, you're making lots of decisions consciously, but only because your brain is giving you that license. Now that license can be revoked in a few thousandths of a second if the brain becomes aware of a threat to you. So we all acknowledge that the brain is running so much of our lives behind the scenes. It's amazing what it does without our knowledge and without any conscious understanding. Running many systems, as I say, in your body simultaneously. So when does your brain take over, and why would your brain do this? Well, the why is the easy part of the, the part of the brain that we're talking about operates on threat. So we could say that it takes over to help you survive. It does so based on information received from your senses as well as the knowledge stored from your experience, and it does so at lightning speed. In any practical evaluation, we could say that the takeover is immediate. I'm going to stop there because I could read on, but I want to just use that part to just quickly explain what is happening when the flesh takes over from the spirit. It does so when it perceives threat to you. And I want you to particularly think of Peter here in the Garden of Gethsemane when he took over. Jesus was about to be arrested, taken to be crucified, and that was all God's plan. And Jesus didn't want anyone getting in the way of that. But Peter jumps in and cuts off the ear of Malchus. And this is probably one of the best examples because he's doing so because he sees the threat to Jesus. But he doesn't do so thinking about God's plan. He does so thinking about his own strength and what he can do to protect the Lord. So in that respect, he's doing the very best he can, and you need to keep hold of that idea because everything within you is doing the best it can. But he's wrong. Jesus says, put away your sword, because those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And he doesn't want anybody to get in the way of his ministry and his work that he has to do for God. So that's the best example that I can give you where, because the disciples here represent the flesh and Jesus represents the spirit, of course. And so you have that same thing living within you. You have a sinful nature, as in Romans 7 and Romans 8 verse 7 particularly. And you have a spirit or consciousness, which is the mind of Christ. So I just wanted to get that idea across as what week 1 will be dealing with. I hope you got something from that. And of course, in group, we'll discuss it further. But those are the 2 basic ideas that week 1 covers. So until next time, bye for now.